Hey everybody, my name is Christian Hyatt. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Risk 360. At Risk 360, we help organizations build security and compliance programs and help them navigate really difficult compliance situations. And so we're excited to provide you an executive summary of the EU AI Act and give you the whole compliance pack. This compliance pack is going to give you a whole video executive summary walking you through the act itself. We've marked up the legislation, so if you want a buddy to go through the actual 150 pages of the legislation itself, you can see our comments with markup. And then in the summary itself, we've highlighted some of the important things that you need to know to comply with the Act. We cover the context of the Act itself in terms of the global context. We cover each article in the EU AI Act in an executive summary format, so you don't have to read the whole 150 pages. We give you a compliance strategy of how you can integrate the EU AI Act into your existing compliance strategy, and we provide some great resources. So whether you want an article by article review at an executive summary level, if you want a compliance strategy, we'll give you that, exactly how we integrate that to existing programs, and also some great free resources. Like I mentioned, this video itself, a download of the Act with our markup and an executive summary that you can share with your team. All of that is inside this EU AI Act compliance pack, and we hope that it adds a lot of value to you. So thanks for dropping by, and we hope that you enjoy it. Hey everybody, we're really excited today. We have another breakdown of a EU regulation that Phil and I have been working on. And today we're going to talk about the EU AI Act and everything that you need to do to be compliant. And we'll talk through a lot of different really fun stuff today and uncover on this one. In way of who we are and why we're doing this, I think the bottom line on Risk 360 is we're, especially me and Phil, I guess over the last few years, we've kind of made it a habit of every time a new regulation comes out, we go through this process where we review the regulation, we think about how a customer could comply with that, especially how they could integrate it with their existing compliance program, and then pull out some of the nuances and some things that you should be paying attention to as you do this. I think this is probably no less than our 10th or 20th framework that we've dissected like this. So we have a lot of experience both interpreting these frameworks, thinking about applicable ways to apply them at your company, and then our team, who's done over 2,000 engagements, going out there and help implement them, audit them, and help companies when it comes to implementing these frameworks. So this is just what we're really excited about, and excited to give you the back brief today. Just in way of a quick individual introduction, so my name is Christian Hyatt. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Risk 360. Been doing this business almost 10 years. Been doing a lot of GRC work, security work, AI work as those frameworks have come out. And just really excited to do this. And we'll talk a little bit about Risk 360 separately so you know who we are and why we're qualified to speak on the topic. But Phil, want to do a quick intro?
Sure. So I oversee a lot of our new framework development, helping understand them, get ready to help companies comply with them. I have a background as CPA, background in information privacy as well. AI is kind of the evolution of privacy, so it makes a
Yep.
lot of sense.
That's funny. I think, Phil, you came up in a international tax research background, got into security and regulatory stuff. And me and Phil together have done GDPR when it came out, all the state level regulations around the US for privacy. Now we did obviously the security frameworks. We just did NIST 2, and here we are doing the EU AI Act. And it's kind of funny, you see the commonalities of these frameworks as we brief them. So we'll try to point out some of that stuff as we go. Just so you know who we are at Risk 360 and why we're doing this kind of work. So we kind of have two sides of our business. We do a lot of compliance advisory. So we do audits. We help companies implement various different security, compliance, and AI frameworks. And then we also help manage those programs. So if companies want to outsource those to us, we do that. Again, we've done over 2,000 engagements across a lot of different types of companies, especially B2B tech companies that are at that intersection of technology and regulation. We really shine there and have a lot of experience. So we'll share some of those war stories today. And the other side of our business is cybersecurity advisory. So we do GRC transformation projects. If you have a really complex multi-framework company in terms of a compliance ecosystem and you're trying to harmonize all that, we do that. We do virtual CISO services. We have a really talented offensive security team. So if you're looking for pen testing, red teaming, or continuous testing, And then we do a lot of other advisory services on the cybersecurity space. So as you can see, just a deep background, a lot of experts that are passionate about this very topic and a lot of the stuff here. And then the last thing I'll mention about Risk 360 is that we have a really cool GRC platform that we help all of our customers manage their programs in. So it's not just the consulting services, this platform where we're building all the intelligence in. So that's us and that's our interest. And in way of why you're here and what you're hoping that we're going to cover. So the journey for today, I think it's really important that we talk about the EU AI Act in context, just a very quick history lesson and how we got here, who the act is applicable to, how you need to be thinking about this in the context of your organization. That'll help set the groundwork for everything else. We're going to talk about the overview of the act itself. So we'll go through the structure so that if you decide to read this, you know what the high notes are, you know how it's structured. And we'll dive into some of the specific requirements because that's probably what you're really curious about. And then after we give you that background, we want to provide some tactical guidance on how you can get compliant. So we'll talk through the implementation process if you want to integrate this into your existing compliance program. And we'll talk about if you want to prove compliance either to your customers, your stakeholders, your internal team, some ways that you can go about that. And then we'll provide at the very end some free resources that you can download where Phil and I have taken the regulation itself and marked it up so that you can kind of see our notes and read the regulation with a friend where we're highlighting interesting areas. You can have this video so you can share it with your colleagues if you'd like, and as well as this slide deck with some markup if you just want the executive summary to share. So we'll be giving you all that. So to dive right in here, let's talk a little bit about how we got here, Phil.
Yeah, so as we all know, AI has been rapidly growing in its usage over the past couple of years. The EU certainly recognizes that. Um, so the EU Commission originated the AI Act, goes through the EU Parliament, EU Council, and ultimately it passed, was officially published in August. So the EU AI Act has now been passed. We're waiting for it to come into fully into force. Um, but ultimately, Recital 6 really covers the EU's goal here. So it says it should serve as a tool for people with the ultimate aim of increasing human well-being. Um, so caught up in that is they recognize AI has so many incredibly beneficial use cases, also many potentially harmful use cases. So how can those be harmonized in a controlled manner? So what they did is they put together this regulation ultimately to encourage innovation, but also protect what the EU calls the fundamental rights of EU citizens. So similar to what you see in privacy legislation.
Yeah, I think a really helpful piece of context. Most of our customers are US based companies that do a lot of business in the EU. So if you're sitting in the US, you have to, it's helpful, I think, to adjust the way you think a little bit. So in the US, we typically take I would say, a business to business enforcement methodology, meaning that the US government typically doesn't take national stances on how they regulate this type of activity. We've seen that in security, in privacy, and now with AI. Typically, you'll see most of the enforcement maybe happening at the state level, but certainly through B2B contracts with like security certifications or AI certifications, and your customers are the ones enforcing these requirements. Whereas in the EU, a lot of it's more centrally required. So you see the EU push out regulations or directives or acts in this case. Those go down to the member states. The member states are asked to interpret that, spin up authoritative, I guess, enforcement agencies, and then enforce it on the companies that operate in those member states. So that is where we're at. So if you're a US based company and you operate in Germany, or I guess England doesn't count this time, but because not necessarily under this, but Germany and other EU states, there could be slightly different nuances to how those countries want to regulate that. So you'd have to take that into consideration. But ultimately, you're going to have to comply with this if you're a global company doing a significant amount of business in the EU. But I think it's just helpful to shift your mindset of how this is coming to fruition basis how it might come to fruition in the United States. And then who is this applicable to, Phil?
Yeah, so just to be clear on how an AI system is defined, it's really looking at autonomous systems. can be adaptive, and ultimately there's some kind of inference in the outputs from that system. We'll point you to exactly where in the Act this definition is. Um, but then, assuming you're using or creating some kind of AI system, outlines four categories of, I guess, participant in the AI ecosystem. So provider who actually makes the model, puts it on the EU market. Uh, Deployer would be someone who uses someone else's system. Um, Importers and distributors are those who are bringing these systems into the EU and don't fall in those first two categories. Um, it has some very minor carve-outs around R&D, personal use, and use for national security, but ultimately, looking at those first 2 points, any AI system that meets those criteria, you have to figure out which bucket you fall in, and
Yep.
then that helps guide you to what you need to do.
Yeah, I guess just to put a fine point on it, it's like if you're a provider, you're thinking companies like OpenAI or Anthropic who are developing their own large language models. That would be the type of company. Or if your company is doing that, you're doing some innovative work around AI development. Deployer means that the easy example is you're using Microsoft Copilot, or you're using a better example is OpenAI or Anthropic's Claude to your own use case, but ultimately you're just using their deployment of a large language model. So that's a way to think about it in terms of applicability. Another thing I'll point out is Phil and I were talking. These are very similar terms. If you're a GRC professional and you're familiar with GDPR, for example, they use words to describe different parties in the privacy ecosystem, like controller or processor. And I feel like that same language is spilling out here. So if you're familiar with those core concepts, this will likely feel very natural to you in terms of who the parties are and how it might be applicable. Jumping into so Phil, we talked a little bit about like, all right, if it's applicable to you, there's basically a way to think through what does the EU define as just totally unacceptable risk, and then what is a high risk system. So can you kind of talk us through how they're thinking about that?
Yeah, so unacceptable risk systems. This is a bright line. If you're deploying one of these systems, you are no longer allowed to put this on the EU market. And that comes into force 6 months from when the act passed. So, February of 2025, that prohibition will be in effect. And these, I encourage everyone to actually read through how the act defines all these systems, but talking about serious risk to people as a result. So, facial recognition, social scoring, like China is doing something like that, where credit scoring is based on many factors besides just your financial history, including like who you know. Um, the minority report systems. This is an interesting one. The movie came out quite a while ago, and now we're close enough to that reality where the EU is, actually calling this out in their regulation.
Yeah, I
Um,
think some of these
yeah.
seem obvious, but like I know companies that are doing something, and we'll talk about an example next, are kind of close to this. So, for
Mhm.
example, if you're talking about facial recognition databases here in the U.S., we have the TSA that has facial recognition. So, if the EU has a system that does something similar, are there use cases where that's okay and use cases where it's not okay? And I think because this is so early, things haven't worked their way through the system yet where they define the nuance between when is it going to be permitted, when it's not, or even things like social scoring systems. Does that include things like non-traditional credit scoring? And I'll give an example of that here in just a second, where you're applying for a loan or a mortgage, and they're taking into account, you know, who your connections on Facebook or LinkedIn are to arrive at a non-traditional credit scoring methodology. Is that okay? Under this, it seems like no, that's not okay in a way, but maybe it is okay. So again, there are some nuanced use cases where I think it might be permitted in the US, but in the EU, they might not permit that, and it has to work itself through the system. So although it is a bright line rule, it's like a no go. I'm curious as if there's some edge cases that will have to work their way through. Um, Talk to us about the high risk
Exactly.
system stuff, Phil.
Yeah, so the AI Act, we'll see the bulk of the text of the act is around regulating high risk systems. Um, so I listed out the categories here. And you'll see as you read through the act, it just calls out a long series of things that you have to do if you're going to put a high risk system on the EU market. Um, so these are things like biometric identification systems. There is a lot of nuance called out in the act around which ones are okay. Like a access control system is okay, but certain other reasons where you might use biometric identification, those would be a potential issue. Systems used in employment, so that's a classic case where potentially a large risk to individuals if your resume gets automatically rejected for what would be considered an unfair or invalid reason. Um, Other law enforcement systems, systems used to evaluate access to essential private and public services. So that's the kind of thing that I'm going to talk through on the next slide. Um, yeah, these are covered in Annex 3. I'll repeat that again, but definitely encourage you to read through it very carefully.
Yep. And I think so. We actually have a really cool client that I think's working through something, or has worked through something that I think is a good example for us to pull this all together and show how it can be complicated, and how you might want to think through these same questions at your own organization. So we had a client that basically was automating lending decisions to borrowers. And a way you can think about that is if you go to a bank and apply for a mortgage, they're going to look at your credit score. They're probably going to look at your job history to make sure you're gainfully employed and some other factors, and arrive at a risk decision on whether or not they're going to lend to you and how much they're going to lend to you. But there's a certain piece of the population. A common example would be people who own businesses who do not have an extensive credit history, or maybe they actually have bad credit, but that's because one of their businesses went bankrupt and now they have a great business, so their cash flow situation is great. So they fall into this weird bucket of highly worthy of being lended to, but not having a good credit score in the traditional sense. So this company came up with some automated ways to make decisions around credit worthiness. And they would take into factors like your cash flow situation. So it could log into your bank and look at how much cash you have and what your cash flow history is. They could look at credit card results. It could look at a lot of open source data available um, through data aggregators to make lending decisions on you. And this was, they weren't calling it AI, they were calling it machine learning, but there's a pretty big, I guess, overlap between those concepts today. And ultimately, they were arriving at a credit scoring decision. And one of the things that this particular client realized is that there appeared to be some bias in the decisions. And obviously, this wasn't purposely done, but certain segments of the population were more frequently being rejected for lending decisions, or they were getting higher interest rates. And there were no humans involved. And this was all based on the system that they had developed. So they had to work through this whole process to define, like, how risky is this? Does this count as social credit score, social scoring, or is this something different? Do they need to make some? Do they need to flag things for manual intervention to kind of self correct? Do they need to update their language model to make different decisioning? They need to retrain the data entirely. Do they need to periodically build things into the system development lifecycle? How do they need to think about doing an AI impact assessment, and so on and so forth? So there was just a lot of questions they had to ask. While their intent was good, I think, was to provide lending decisions to people who otherwise couldn't get them. They had to think deeply about what category this fell in, how they wanted to think about it, and then also some of their biggest partners wanted that validation too. So they had to think through, should they get certification? like a security certification, but also an ISO certification like 42001. So how are they going to prove out compliance? So if you, I share this story because on the surface of it, this is a lending company. It didn't seem like that complicated of a thing, but when you started pulling back the covers of the nuances they were doing, some of the decisions that they were trying to make, how it was impacting the rights and freedoms of individuals based on those lending decisions, it became really complicated. And it wasn't just a technical problem; it was management determining what their philosophy was when it comes to managing risk around AI. And that might be true of your organization too. You might be doing something and really have to pull back these principles. And I think this is a common example of a type of customer that would be impacted by the EU AI Act. So, Phil, that's kind of an example. I think it's important that we dive into the structure because how
Hmm.
long was the do you know offhand like how many hundreds of pages was this act? It was a doozy.
Yeah, I think with recitals, it's about 150 pages.
Yeah, so 150 pages and about 8-point font, and PhD level writing to interpret. So it's quite a lot to plow through. So what we're going to go through now is we're going to give you chapter by chapter and article by article, basically how it's structured. So if you want to dive into it, you'll know how to navigate it a little bit. And we'll also highlight a few articles that we think is especially valuable for you to read. So the way I would use this section is go ahead and download our markup of the regulation. You can get that, and Phil has already marked it up with comments and highlights. And you can use this section to navigate it like a table of contents, and then Phil's comments, if you want to really dive in deep, to narrow in on some interesting sections of the act that are highly applicable to you. But Phil, will you go ahead and just kind of give us the high notes of how the act is structured?
Sure. So, one thing with any EU act, it always starts with recitals, which one, talk a lot about the background for why they're choosing to do this. Then it also talks just in a different way than the text of the regulation about certain problematic situations, and that pertains to it, it relates to a section that's within the text, so it just provides you more nuance and context around what they're aiming for with a particular requirement. So you might not want to read through all of it, but sometimes if you're having trouble unpacking something within the body, it helps to find where it is within the recitals. Um, so then chapter one, this is where you'll find your definitions. So if you want to go back and say, so what was an AI system to begin with? That's where you'll find it. Um, chapter two, so this is critical. This is where it has spelled out what those prohibited AI systems are. Um, just a reminder, this ban is not disputable, so you want to understand that definition extremely carefully, probably with counsel, to understand how it relates to the AI systems you're using. Um, then you'll see a lot of space is devoted to high-risk AI systems. We'll go into some of those requirements a little later. Um, Article 50, so Chapter 4, is AI systems that fall outside those first two categories. There are some transparency obligations, so you can look there for more. Chapter 5 specifically calls out AI models. So something like OpenAI has some additional compliance issues or requirements here. Um, Chapter 6 is interesting. It talks about how they intend to encourage innovation with the Act. Uh, there's this idea of the AI regulatory sandbox where there's this public-private cooperation, maybe some subsidies to encourage companies to develop AI in innovative ways, but with their you know, supervisory authorities and with that public oversight. Chapter 7 calls out all of the different governance offices and committees that are required to enforce and implement this act. Uh, Several of those are already in place and have begun meeting. Um, Chapter 8, there is a registration requirement for high risk systems. So you have to send to this centralized group information about your system, and they will actually be maintaining a database of those. Um, Again, a very EU concept here. Um, Interested to see more about that and how it looks, how it operates,
Yeah,
what
just
will be published.
I think interesting trend we're seeing is between some of the recent EU directives and regulations, between this to DORA and EU AI Act, which are all kind of coming together at the same time. They all have the same concept of the registration in the database. So we might be, 3 years from now, after this is all rolled out, there's going to be some pretty important databases that are tracking critical infrastructure, high risk cybersecurity systems, high risk AI systems. So I'm curious how that is going to impact the ability to regulate. Because if you look at something like GDPR, I don't think they had such a formal registration process per se, and uh, enforcement has largely been on the biggest companies. Like if you're Facebook or Google, you know EU is probably going to take a look at you, and I wonder if that'll change at all with this registration process that the EU AI Act and NIS2 and others have, where the authorities can zero in on some high risk systems and like do some assessments and some audits. I don't think we have the answer to that yet, but it is an interesting concept, and I'm wondering if that's kind of a lesson learned from some other acts that they've implemented.
Agreed. I think there's definitely some lessons from GDPR that I see applied here. Um, so if we look at the next slide, I think one example is penalties. So GDPR was very specific, the 2% or 4% penalties. The AI Act, on the other hand, it has these guidelines, which I've listed here, but there's more lenience or room for interpretation based on like intent. Was it a willful violation? Other things that a regulator might take into consideration. I think it reflects like under GDPR, I think we rarely saw those top line fines actually being levied. So the AI Act is written a little differently, but you can see penalties potentially higher than GDPR. So if you continue to deploy a prohibited AI system, that's a 7% of sales potential fine, 5% potentially for failing to comply with your obligations as a provider, deployer, importer, whatever your role is, and then also a potential penalty for providing misleading information.
Yeah, I think that's the one that's really going to get people, is that a 1% for misleading information. That's a fairly broad interpretation of, and then you get into,
Yeah.
was it intentionally misleading or was it accidentally misleading? So it'll be really interesting to see how that works its way through the system as well.
Mhm. Definitely. And then just one other item to call out on this slide, the annexes, uh, like Christian told me as we talked about this, this is where the gold is. Um, so you'll see a lot of more prescriptive guidance when it talks about something like preparing technical documentation. It compiles together exactly what that includes. Concept like a conformity assessment, same kind of thing. Um, It's also where to find your list of high-risk systems and your registration requirements. So definitely don't skip the annexes.
Yep, we see that across. I'll give everyone a tip. Like you take ISO 27001 for example, or ISO 42001. You read the or this AI Act, for example, you read the regulation or you read the primary documents. It gives you a lot of guidelines, but there's some cool tidbits in those annexes. Like I love the list of high risk systems because even if you don't care about the regulation, that's a pretty good inventory to impact the way you think about stuff when you're doing maybe a broader risk assessment. So check out those annexes. I think there's some good thinking models in there and just some value um, outside of just this regulation itself as you're thinking through risk management. So we talked about high risk systems. We talked about the structure of the act. Again, download the regulation yourself that we've provided to check out our comments. I think that'll be a guide. And let's dive into like what is required at a high level. What does the EU Act require that you actually do?
Hmm. So we took the requirements and kind of broke them into four buckets. So one is a risk management program. Kind of have a risk management program around AI. The fundamental rights impact assessment. This very similar to a privacy impact assessment. It covers how your AI system potentially affects individuals and the rights and freedoms of individuals. Um, so right now, this is around things like those lending companies. The the specific category was like access to essential services. Those are the only ones required to do this fundamental rights assessment right now. I'd say you know it's just a critical tool in our opinion for anyone deploying a potentially risky system to make sure you're doing your part to protect people as the system's being used. Next category, technical documentation. So this is a term that comes from the Act. Annex 4 has all the details, but it's like your own package that you put together of what your system is and how it's complying with the AI Act. So it includes the Act actually calls out the term quality management system. Doesn't have to be ISO based, but it's always a good place to start. The Act does call out very similar things to what you'd expect in a ISO 9001 QMS. Um, but look at Annex 4, that will describe all of the technical documentation that needs to be prepared. Um, there are principles for system design, how you provide instructions to anyone who uses the system, procedures for human oversight if there's any kind of complaint, um, making sure the data is accurate, the system is robust, and everything is adequately secured, logging requirements. Um, and then the last bucket is the idea of an EU representative. So this is another very common thing across these EU regulations is you need to have someone appointed within the EU for them to contact with any concerns about the system, someone to act on your behalf if you're not actually located in the EU. Yeah, so with all that in mind, there are a few things that we still don't know. You know, this just was passed a few months ago. So first question on everyone's mind is just how closely will it be enforced? What do those bodies look like who are going to enforce it? What will punitive activity around fines look like? Um, all unknown right now. Definitely look as the requirements come into force, look for enforcement actions. We'll be monitoring those closely, and you know, ultimately, it's how you interpret interpret what these different requirements look like is how they're actually being enforced. Um, Also, a great question. What's involved in the EU database for high risk systems? How are the competent authorities interacting with those? Um, Regulatory sandboxes, like I mentioned, a very interesting concept. How will incentives be aligned to get companies actually using those, um, to create that partnership that the EU is looking for? And then just one last item. There's this concept of a conformity assessment um, called out a few times in the Act. Um, it's very limited in scope right now, but there's a hint in the recitals that it could be more significant in the future. And that would be required to be performed by an external party if it becomes more rigorous. So we'll see if and when that requirement is expanded to more AU, excuse me, to more AI deployers and providers.
Yep. Awesome. So hopefully now, I mean, everyone has a pretty good understanding of the blocking and tackling of the act. And I think from here, what we want to cover is how should you be thinking about trying to comply with this? And I think Phil and I thought through what we've seen from GDPR, from other relevant EU acts, and what we've seen with clients, and have a pretty good plan here. So I do think it's important to outline who we're talking to here, though. So almost all of our clients already have a compliance program. You probably already have a compliance program, and what we see is typically those compliance programs are global, and you're already complying with multiple frameworks: ISO 27001, SOC 2, GDPR, HIPAA if you're in the US, just a ton of compliance that you're already doing. And the EU AI Act represents just another thing that you have to comply with, and then you have to integrate into your existing program. And we also understand that that can be extremely costly and burdensome for your organization. You don't want to operate this in a silo, spend more budget on yet another regulation, hire more people to manage yet another regulation. There will be some of that, but to the extent possible, you want to harmonize this. So that's where our mind is when we think about ingesting all of these new requirements. We're thinking about how to build stuff that's scalable and efficient. We're thinking about operationalizing them where you can have repeatable success, you can demonstrate your compliance, and ultimately harmonizing all of this compliance work into one unified body. And for example, if you're already doing ISO 42001, ISO 27001, GDPR 27701, there's like you're probably doing 70 or 80% of the EU AI Act, and there's just some additional concepts that you need to apply. So we want to talk through how you could do that. So if this sounds like you and you're trying to integrate the EU AI Act into an existing body of work, that's exactly what we're going to talk through right now. What we want to be able to do, I think we're goal oriented. So like objectives of integrating the EU AI Act, um, integrating it, like I said, into your existing risk management program. So how do you do that? Everything from governing body, policies, procedures, risk management program, doing risk assessments, getting your external audits, reporting up to the boards. How do you integrate it? It's just another framework, just another requirement. You want to keep the work efficient. Like I said earlier, you don't want to spin up a whole separate infrastructure and personnel and processes to do this. So it needs to be efficient. And ultimately, you do need to be able to communicate your compliance posture of the EUAI Act. You probably need to communicate it to customers, your board of directors, your own internal stakeholders. You're probably working across the table with your engineering team who's developing these systems. So how do you communicate it? So those are the three desired outcomes that we're focused in on. So our typical roadmap, and I want you to be able to use this as a thinking model. So as you communicate to your team how to ingest this, here's some words that hopefully you can do. So our process typically is first of all, we need to do a current state assessment. And with the EUAI Act, there's two things when I think of a current state assessment. Number one is doing a risk assessment. So how are you using AI? Are you building the systems? Do they fall into the prohibited category? Are they the high risk category? Or is it really not much risk at all? And what's the impact to your organization? And then what's the impact to people in the world? So you need to do a risk assessment because that's going to be your decision point, whether you need to take this very seriously or if it's not that high of a risk to your organization or people. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is based on how high of a risk this is for you, you need to do some type of maturity assessment. Typically for us, that looks like a gap assessment against the framework itself. So you'll know what you're doing, what you're not doing, and how to close the gap between where you want to be and where you are. And that's our maturity roadmap. And that will get you off to the races. And one of the questions I ask myself as we do this current state assessment is, do we have a defensible approach? So if a customer was to come asking questions, if a stakeholder asks questions, if a regulatory body were to come look at us, can we defend the approach that we took? So the level of documentation needs to withstand that level of scrutiny. So that's kind of our first step. And then into the second step, we take that maturity roadmap, and you need to figure out how to integrate it and harmonize it with your existing compliance program. I'll give you a couple concrete examples. For example, all of this stuff requires governance. So one of the governance councils that we spin up with organizations, we call it the Information Risk Council. Information Risk Council typically controls security, privacy, probably AI, probably some other risk, information risk related things. That could all be the same council at the same table. You don't need a whole separate AI governance committee necessarily. So we need to look at org structure, governance, and figure out where that fits in. Same with your policies, same with your risk assessments, how you manage incidents. There's a whole body of governance work and program integration that you probably want this act to fit in. You don't want separate processes. So inventorying that thing and inventorying your program and figuring out based on your maturity roadmap and your defensible approach how that all fits together like a puzzle. Once you've harmonized it, you probably have gaps. So if, to use the same example, maybe you have a risk council today, but they're not talking about AI at all. There's nowhere on the agenda where they're talking about that. So that might be an easy new thing that they need visibility into, and you have to implement that. You're probably missing policies. Your engineering team is probably not considering AI impact assessments as they're bringing new features to the market. So there will be gaps that you have to do it, but you don't want to hurt the business. You don't want to implement so much bureaucracy that your business just can't operate. But you do want to establish a defensible approach. So architecting those solutions sometimes takes a little bit of thought, and that's somewhere we spend a lot of time thinking about. And then ultimately, you want to operationalize the work streams. So you have all this new stuff. You need to do it where it's repeatable, scalable, and it becomes habit forming rather than a net new process. So to use that same exact example, your governance committee has made it a habit to talk about AI related risk, just like security, just like privacy and other types of risks. So it's habit forming and operationalizing. So that's kind of the ecosystem. I know that's very high level, but this generally speaking is our 4-step process to bring new compliance frameworks into an organization very efficiently and very effectively. And then I want you to start also think about how you're going to prove compliance, because that's an important business requirement. The folks that you're typically proving compliance to are folks like your board of directors, maybe just the executives at your company. You need to show them that you're actually compliant, so inspire confidence. Definitely going to have to show compliance to regulators at certain times. Maybe you're going to get sued. I hope not, but there's always litigation risks, so you got to think about that. And then ultimately, you want to inspire trust with your customers. We are already seeing an abundance of AI clauses inside contracts. So we've seen contracts that outright ban the use of AI without permission. We've seen whole standard contractual agreement equivalents that highlight do's and don'ts for AI risk. We've even seen people allude to the requirement to comply with future legislation like the EU AI Act. So you will have to, in the sales cycle and to maintain your existing customers, figure out ways to prove compliance. So we think ways you can do that is through a great risk assessment. Number one, thinking about the evidence to the evidence that you will need to produce to demonstrate compliance to your customers and stakeholders. Things like continuous monitoring of controls or internal audits. You're probably going to get some external audits and certifications, like ISO 42001 is a popular AI certification right now. Demonstrating that your cybersecurity program takes into account AI related risk as well, and you're securing AI systems. Same thing with privacy. Are you considering the data privacy of individuals and how you're training the data and how that could impact them? And also data quality. So thinking about all that. One of the things that we recommend, because there's currently no certification for the EU AI Act, I don't suspect there will be, is two things. One, you could do something like ISO 42001 certifications. There's not a one-to-one match. I'll talk about that in just a second. But also considering creating some transparency reports. So in this case, maybe an EU AI Act transparency report where you're proactive and you communicate to your customers your interpretation of the requirements and how you meet those requirements or exceed them. And we've seen that that's a very powerful tool if you need to communicate with external and internal stakeholders. One thing I want to address directly as we kind of close out here is there are questions about how close is ISO 42001 in terms of getting you compliant with the EU AI Act. So if you're not familiar with ISO 42001, it's the first and currently the only available official certification that you can get from a third party as related to AI risk management. So if you haven't read 42001, definitely do read it. We actually have a whole course on it that's free. So if you go to the Risk 360 website and look at resources and look at courses, there's an ISO 42001 course that we put together that'll get you up to speed in a couple hours on that whole framework. And it's a really good risk management framework. And I do think there's a ton of overlap in principle between the EU AI Act and 42001. So things like governance, doing risk assessments, thinking about data cleanliness and training models and AI impact assessments and policies, that stuff exists in both. So there's a ton of overlap. So if you do 42001, I think it will get you very close to the EU AI Act, but not totally. So what are those areas where it will not get you all the way over the finish line? Number one, we think you need to take scope carefully into consideration. So it is possible. ISO 42001 is about a scope. You're getting something certified. So maybe you're not getting the system certified that the EU AI Act is applicable to. So make sure you have scope overlap. There's also some specific regulatory documentation. Phil mentioned a lot of it. I think it was Article 4 that was in other documents. But examples like you have to have an EU representative. 42001 doesn't require that. You have to respond to requests from regulators. 42001 doesn't require that. There's some nuanced technical documentation that could be regulatory specific. The last thing is 42001 is not a security or privacy framework. It's an AI risk management framework. So you will have to separately think about things like data protection, retention, vulnerability management, and so on. So one of the tips that I will give you is if you really want to take core concepts and apply them to the EU AI Act, I think some of the places I would look is ISO 27001, which is security, ISO 27701, which is privacy, ISO 42001, which is AI risk management, ISO 22301, which is business continuity, and ISO 9001, that is quality management. I think if you look at those, there's principles within those that will get you all the way or nearly all the way to the EU AI Act. And I know that there's people listening right now that probably get multiple certifications like those. So there's a cool opportunity to create what is called an integrated management system where you're achieving multiple certifications in one external audit. So just consider that. Those are some thoughts for you to think through when it comes to 42001. And the last thing that we'll provide here is that free download. So if you look at the description of this video, there will be a link where you can download all of this stuff. Number one is the EU Act video. So there will be an executive summary as well as this video itself. So if you would like to provide that to colleagues, we'll also have an executive summary video. So if you just want to provide them the 5-minute version so they can decide if it's worth their time, that resource will be made available to you. We also have the EU Act executive summary. So in written format, it'll be kind of a version of the slide deck. So if you have someone who doesn't want to watch the video, but they like to read through the materials, there's a good executive summary that you can download. And then one of the most valuable things I think that we've created is the act itself marked up with our comments, more specifically with Phil's comments, where Phil has combed through all 150 pages, highlighted different sections, made comments where things are interesting. And the way I like to think about that is like reading the regulation with a buddy, someone who's already looked at it and is pointing out interesting things on your behalf to help narrow your focus to take reading 150 pages down to reading a summary of it. So all that is in our EU AI Act compliance pack, and we hope you find that super valuable. So Phil, thank you for your time combing through all of this. And if you're watching, I really hope you found value here. Please do share this with everyone. If you have feedback or comments, let us know. We'd love to hear what kind of content you find valuable and if you found this valuable. So thank you very much.